By and large, there's a huge section of the Browns fan base that is not happy with Andrew Berry's drafting relative to players. Important to note, didn't have number one picks for 3 years, and it's his own doing. He traded them to get Deshaun Watson, which obviously bad trade. But let's take a look at some of his draft choices. This is one that the detractors point to all the time, and it's a bad one without question. 2020, his first number one or first round draft pick was Jedrick Wills. He passed on Mekhi Becton, he passed on Tristan Wirfs, he passed on CeeDee Lamb, and he passed on Justin Jefferson. Obviously, that was a huge miss. Now here's his other first round pick during his tenure. And it's first round 26th pick. It was Greg Newsome. Bateman, Stokes, Owe, Tyson Campbell. So everybody's kind of pointing to Greg Newsome. At that level in the first round, he really wasn't that bad of a pick. So I'll defend that one. I can't defend this one. This is in the fourth round, and he took a kicker who they ended up cutting. Jake Ferguson, Calvin Austin, Isaiah Likely, all taken around that pick in the fourth round when he did. So those are some of the questions that people have. The Greg Newsome one, people keep saying, well, he's not going to get a second contract. When you look at who was on the board relative to Greg Newsome, that wasn't a bad pick.
No, I think the Greg Newsome pick was fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Look, if you want to criticize Andrew Berry's overall drafting since he's been the GM, I think there's plenty of room to do that. Like the Jedrick Wills pick, I think makes a ton of sense to criticize because there was a lot of tackles at the top of that draft. So it's not like we are saying, well, they could have drafted this other completely different player at a completely different position who was never really in consideration. They were a tackle needy team in a draft where there were a lot of tackles at the top of that draft, and they chose maybe the worst of that entire group. That's worth criticizing. The thing that I would point out, though, is that, look, nobody's particularly good at the draft, right? And this is part of where it gets tricky when you start evaluating general managers and those kinds of things. It's why there's so much more to the job than simply did you draft well over the last few years. How did you do in free agency? How did you do with your own contracts? There's a lot of things to go along with being a general manager. And almost everybody over a period of time is not particularly good at the draft. So the strike rate is not good for anybody. So when you're looking at a guy and you're saying, well, look at this pick, this was bad, and this was bad, and this was bad. Most picks for most general managers are bad, right? That's just the way the draft works. One thing I think that is fair to do is to start looking at process. And that's where a pick like the Cade York pick, even though it's a lower pick and it's not a first rounder, that's where I think you can bring some criticism to the table because, the data and the information that Andrew Berry has to hand would say, don't ever spend that pick on a kicker, ever. Just don't do it. The chances are it's almost never going to work out well for a kicker. You don't tend to spend draft capital on those guys because there isn't a huge differentiator between the ones you draft and the ones you pick up as an undrafted free agent after the draft without spending the draft pick. So, I think you can look at Andrew Berry's drafting and say there are various individual picks or individual moves where he failed or he didn't do a particularly good job or he didn't follow the analytics or the data or, the chances. He didn't play the percentages. But I think overall, you look at his body of work and say, generally, he's done a pretty good job with the one giant caveat hanging over that you mentioned right at the start of this, the Deshaun Watson trade, right? Which is one of the reasons he didn't have first round draft picks, which is also, even independent of what they gave up to get him, one of the worst personnel moves that's ever been made.
So when you look at a draft class or a draft pick, how many years is fair to say, okay, this guy just isn't going to be as good or is really good relative to where he was drafted?
I think it depends on the player. Sometimes you can see immediately this guy's a different player than we thought he was at draft time, and you can tell right away that everybody goofed. After 3 years, though, I think you can fairly evaluate a draft class come what may, because generally speaking, most of these kids are on 4-year rookie contracts. So if they haven't shown it by the end of year three, it almost doesn't matter if they come good in the fourth year, because then it's a contract year. You either have to pay them big money, or he goes and plays, his best football for somebody else. So either way, it wasn't a good draft pick for you because you didn't get the benefit without paying market value for them. You didn't get the surplus value of them being good players on that rookie contract. So I would say you can definitely tell from some players right away, but after 3 years, you can tell from everybody.